The funeral had been over for 2 hours when my sister-in-law stood up in my living room, tapped a spoon against a wine glass, and told 40 people that I had until Friday to leave the house. I was standing by the window when she did it. I had a tray of coffee cups in my hands, because even on the day I buried my husband, I was still the one refilling everyone's cup. That should tell you everything about the 31 years I'd spent in that family. I heard the little chime of metal on glass, and I turned, and there was Diane, my husband Thomas's younger sister, holding up a single sheet of paper like it was a trophy she'd won. "Everyone, if I could have your attention," she said, in the same warm voice she used at Christmas. "I know today has been hard, but the family has talked, and we think it's best if we handle Thomas's wishes now while we're all together. I want you to sit with that word for a second, the family, as if I hadn't been part of that family for 3 decades. As if I hadn't nursed her mother through her last winter, hadn't co-signed the loan that saved her son's first apartment, hadn't hosted every single holiday in the very room she was now standing in." She read from the paper. She said Thomas had always wanted the house to stay in the Radley bloodline. She said, and I remember every word because I have never forgotten a single one of them. "We all agreed it's only fair. Eleanor, you have until Friday to get your things and move out. Grant and his family will be taking the house." Grant, her son, 34 years old, 3 months behind on his own rent, standing in the corner staring at his shoes. The room went quiet. 40 people I had fed and welcomed and loved, and not one of them said a word. My brother-in-law Roy looked at the floor. My own husband's cousins looked out the window, and Diane stood there with a small, satisfied smile, waiting for me to break. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I set the tray of coffee cups down on the side table, very carefully, so that not one of them rattled. I smoothed the front of my black dress, and I said one word, "Understood." Then I picked the tray back up, and I kept pouring coffee, because someone had to, and because I had already decided, in the space of about 4 seconds, that I was not going to give Diane the show she'd dressed up for. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had read the actual will, the whole thing, all 11 pages of it, and what Diane held in her hand that afternoon was not the will. It was a 1-page summary she'd typed up herself. She never read page 7. But to understand why page 7 mattered, and why my hands weren't shaking the way she expected them to, you have to go back. You have to understand who I was in that family, and who I had been for a very long time. My name is Eleanor Radley. Most people call me Nell. I was 57 years old the day I buried Thomas, and for most of my marriage I believed something that turned out not to be true. I believed that if I was useful enough, if I was the one who remembered the birthdays and balanced the books and kept the peace, then I would be safe. That being needed and being loved were the same thing. It took me until I was 57, standing in my own living room being told to leave, to understand they are not the same thing at all. I met Thomas when I was 26. I was a paralegal at a small firm downtown, and he came in to sort out a mess with his late father's estate. He was gentle in a way that surprised me, the kind of man who apologized to furniture when he bumped into it. We married 18 months later. We never had children of our own, it didn't happen for us, and after a while we stopped grieving it and started pouring that love into everyone else's children instead. His nieces and nephews, the neighbor kids, Grant most of all. The Radleys were a big, loud, close family, and I loved that about them at first. Sunday dinners that ran until midnight. Everyone in everyone's business. When you marry into a family like that, they tell you you're one of them now, and for a while I believed it. Diane was 3 years younger than Thomas. From the beginning, there was something about the way she looked at me, a kind of appraisal, like she was checking a receipt. Thomas adored her. He was the older brother who had practically raised her after their father died young, and he could never quite see her clearly. To him, she was always the little sister who needed protecting. To me, over the years, she became something else. It started small, it always does. At the first Christmas, she rearranged the gifts under the tree so that hers were in front. A joke, everyone said. When I hosted Thanksgiving, she'd arrive an hour early to help, then spend that hour telling me what I was doing wrong in my own kitchen. When Thomas and I bought the house, a solid brick colonial with a wide porch and a maple tree out front, she walked through it once and said, "Well, It's a lot of house for two people who couldn't have kids. She smiled when she said it, she always smiled. I told myself a lot of things back then. I told myself she didn't mean it. I told myself she was grieving her own life, which hadn't gone the way she'd wanted. I told myself family was family, and you don't keep score. I was very good at telling myself things. Here is the part I want to be honest about, because I made mistakes too. I let it happen. Every time I smoothed it over, every time I said, that's just how Diane is, I taught them all that there would be no cost. Kindness without a boundary isn't kindness, it's an invitation. I know that now. The years stacked up the way years do. Thomas's mother got sick, and I was the one who moved into her spare room for 4 months to care for her, changing her sheets, and reading to her at night, while Diane visited on Sundays and posted photographs of herself holding her mother's hand. When Grant needed a co-signer for his first apartment, it was our name on the lease, and when he stopped paying, it was our savings that covered it. When Diane's second marriage fell apart and she needed somewhere to land, Thomas quietly bought a small lake cottage 2 hours north and let her live in it, rent-free, just until she got back on her feet. That was 11 years ago. She never left it. She still lives there today. Or she did. I need you to hold on to that lake cottage. It matters more than anyone at that funeral understood. Because here is what I knew that Diane did not. I knew how Thomas handled money. I had watched him do it for 31 years, and I had helped him do it. Thomas was gentle, but he was not naive. His own father had died without a proper will, and the family had torn itself to pieces over the scraps. Thomas swore he would never let that happen to the people he loved. So, about 9 years ago, he sat down with an attorney, an old friend of mine, actually. A woman named Ruth Callahan I'd worked with back in my paralegal days, and he did something quiet and careful and completely legal. He put nearly everything into a family trust. The house, the lake cottage, the investment accounts, the small commercial building downtown that his father had left him, the one that brought in rent every month. The rent that had been quietly paying for Grant's tuition and Diane's cottage and half the family's Christmases for years. All of it went into the Thomas Radley Family Trust, and he named a sole trustee. One person, with full authority over every asset, every distribution, every dollar, for the rest of that person's life, with the power to decide what happened to it all after. He named me. I didn't ask him to. I remember the evening he told me. We were sitting on the porch, and he took my hand and said, "Nell, if anything ever happens to me, I don't want you at their mercy. I've seen what this family does over money. I need to know you'll never have to ask anyone for permission to live your own life." I told him he was being morbid. He just smiled and said, "Humor me. Read it. All of it. Especially page 7. Page 7 was the trustee appointment. Page 7 named me, and only me. Page 7 made every other person in that family, including Diane, who lived in a trust-owned cottage, including Grant, whose tuition came from trust income, a beneficiary whose distributions were entirely at the discretion of the trustee, me. So when Diane stood in my living room and read a 1-page summary she'd typed up herself, a summary that said the house should stay in the bloodline, she was reading a wish, a fiction, something she wanted to be true. She had never seen the actual document. She'd assumed the way she assumed everything, that because I was quiet, because I poured the coffee, because I never fought back, I must also be powerless. She thought grief had made me soft and easy to push. She had it exactly backwards. Let me take you back to that afternoon, to the moment after I said understood, because that word was not surrender, that word was a door closing. Something in me went very still, not loud, not dramatic. It was the stillness of a person who has just realized, with total clarity, that the thing she feared most has finally happened and it is survivable. All those years I'd been afraid of losing them, of being cast out, of not belonging. And here it was, the actual moment, and it turned out the fear had been so much bigger than the event. They were casting me out, fine. I finally knew exactly where I stood. I finished serving the coffee. I said goodbye to the guests who would meet my eyes and to the ones who wouldn't. I washed every cup by hand. And when the last car pulled out of the driveway, I sat down at Thomas's desk, opened the bottom drawer, and took out the folder. The real one. 11 pages, Thomas's signature on the last one, Ruth Callahan's notary seal beside it. Then I did the first thing I would do right, after so many years of doing the easy thing. I did not call Diane and scream at her. Anger burns fast and clean and leaves you with nothing. What I needed would take longer than that. I called Ruth. Ruth Callahan was 71 by then, mostly retired, sharp as a tack. She'd been at the funeral, quietly, in the back. When I told her what Diane had done, there was a long pause on the line, and then she said the thing I have thought about every day since. She said, "Eleanor, you have spent your whole life being the reasonable one. Be reasonable one more time. Don't get angry. Get organized. Get organized." So I did. Over the next 3 weeks, while Diane sent me increasingly impatient text messages about my Friday deadline messages I saved, every one I built something. Not a weapon, exactly. The truth doesn't need to be a weapon. I built a record. I gathered the trust documents. I gathered 11 years of records showing the trust had paid every dollar of the Lake Cottage's taxes and upkeep. I gathered the tuition payments for Grant. I gathered the co-signed lease from his first apartment, and the bank records showing our savings had covered his missed payments. I gathered the receipts for the 4 months I'd spent caring for Thomas's mother. Not because I planned to demand any of it back, but because when the truth finally surfaced, I wanted it to surface completely, with nothing anyone could argue about. And I want to tell you about the illness, because it's the part that still sits heaviest in me. Thomas had been sick for 8 months before he died. Heart failure, the slow kind, the kind that gives you time. And in those 8 months, I learned exactly who this family was. Diane visited 3 times, in 8 months. Once she came and spent the whole visit on her phone. Grant came once, to ask if Thomas could look over his resume. I was the one who drove him to every appointment. I was the one who learned to read the monitors, who slept in the chair beside his hospital bed, who held the little pink sponge to his lips when he couldn't drink. On his last clear evening, he squeezed my hand and said, "You were the only one who ever really showed up, Nell. Don't let them make you forget that." I thought he was just talking about the illness. I understand now he was talking about everything. He knew. He'd always known. The vulnerable moment shows you who performs love and who provides it. Diane performed it beautifully. She cried the loudest at the funeral. She hugged the most people. And then, 2 hours later, she told me to get out of my house. That's not a contradiction. That's the whole truth of her, laid bare. She had never loved us. She had loved what we gave. Now, the reckoning. I could have simply mailed Diane a copy of the trust and let her figure it out. But I'd learned something from watching Thomas, and from Ruth. When the truth needs to land, it should land clearly, calmly, in front of witnesses, so that it can never be denied or twisted later. So I did something Diane never expected. I invited the family to a meeting. I sent a warm, gracious message to everyone who'd been at the funeral. I said I wanted us all to sit down together, with the family's attorney present, to go over Thomas's actual wishes properly, so there'd be no confusion and no hard feelings. Diane responded within minutes. She was thrilled. She thought I was surrendering. She thought this was the meeting where I'd hand over the keys. She even offered to bring Grant's moving boxes. We met in Ruth's office on a Tuesday morning. Diane arrived in a new blazer, radiant, with Grant trailing behind her holding an empty box, if you can believe that. The rest of the family filed in: Roy, the cousins, a few others. And when everyone was seated, Ruth slid copies of the actual, complete, signed, notarized trust document across the table to every person in the room. 11 pages, not one. Ruth walked them through it in her calm, retired attorney voice. She explained what a family trust was. She explained that Thomas had established it 9 years earlier, entirely of his own free will, of sound mind, properly witnessed. She explained which assets it held. And then she asked everyone to turn to page 7. I watched Diane's face change in real time. It is the only part of this whole story I'm not entirely proud of enjoying, but I won't lie to you and say I didn't feel something as I watched it. She read page 7. She read it again. The color left her face the way water leaves a sink. She looked up at Ruth, and then at me, and she said, in a voice that had lost all its warmth, "This can't be right." Ruth said, very gently, "It is entirely right. Mrs. Radley Eleanor is the sole trustee. She has full authority over every asset in this trust, including the residence you attempted to reassign, and including the lake property that has been Miss Radley's your residence for the past 11 years, which the trust owns outright and has funded entirely. I want to describe the silence in that room, because I had waited 31 years for it. It was not a triumphant silence. It was the silence of 40 years of assumptions collapsing all at once. Grant set his empty box down on the floor very quietly. Roy put his face in his hands. Diane did what people like Diane always do. She got angry. She said I had manipulated Thomas. She said I'd never really been family. She said a great many things, and I let her say them, because Ruth was writing them down, and because every word made the truth of who she was more undeniable to the people watching. And when she finally ran out of breath, I spoke. I did not raise my voice. I said, Diane, for 31 years I served this family. I asked for nothing. When you told me to leave my home 2 hours after I buried my husband, I said one word to you. I said understood, and I meant it. I finally understood exactly what I was to you. I slid a folder across the table to her. This is a record of everything the trust has paid for over the last 11 years. Your cottage, its taxes, its roof, Grant's tuition. I am not asking for any of it back. Thomas wanted you cared for, and I intend to honor what my husband wanted, because unlike you, I actually listened to him. But you will never again tell me where I am allowed to live. Now, the consequences, and here is where I want to be careful, because this channel is not about revenge, and neither am I. I did not throw Diane out of the cottage. I want to be clear about that, because it would have been so easy, and a lesser story would have ended there with a slam door. I let her stay, but I restructured everything the way it should have been from the start. I set the trust up so that Diane received a modest, fixed monthly distribution enough to live with dignity, not enough to fund the lifestyle she'd been performing at everyone else's expense. Grant, I told, could have his tuition covered on one condition, that he actually finished the degree he'd abandoned twice. He's in his final semester now. He calls me sometimes. I think he's the only one who understood what actually happened in that room. Diane's real consequence was not financial. It was this: everyone saw. The whole family saw what she'd tried to do. And they saw who I actually was. And no amount of new blazers has ever repaired that. She undid herself. She always would have. Greed doesn't need an enemy. It only needs enough rope. I just stopped handing it to her, one length at a time. Not everyone stayed a villain. And I want to tell you about Roy, because the aftermath is never as clean as we'd like. A few weeks after the meeting, Thomas's brother Roy came to my door. He stood on the porch, the same porch where Thomas had once told me he never wanted me at their mercy, and he cried. He said, I sat there at the funeral and I said nothing while she did that to you. Thomas would be ashamed of me. I'm ashamed of me. I made him coffee. We sat for a long time. Some relationships can be mended, if the person is willing to be honest about the damage. Roy was. We're close now, closer than we ever were when Thomas was alive. Diane and I have not spoken in over a year. I've made my peace with that. Not every relationship is meant to be saved, and part of growing up even at 57 is learning the difference between the ones worth mending and the ones worth releasing. I still live in the brick colonial with the maple out front, but I don't spend much time there anymore. I spend most of my time at the lake. No, not Diane's cottage. I built a small place of my own on the other side of the water, with wide windows and a little dock. I wake up early now, on purpose, because I've discovered I love the way the light comes across the lake at 6 in the morning, gold and quiet and entirely mine. I have coffee on the dock. I pour it for exactly one person now, and I've found I don't mind that at all. The grandchildren, Roy's grandchildren, and Grant's little girl, who is 4 and calls me Aunt Nell, they come to the lake in the summers. I've set up the trust so that when I'm gone, it will help every one of them with school, with a first home, with a start in life. Not one of them will ever have to beg to be chosen. That, more than anything, is what winning looked like for me. It was never about punishing Diane. It was about making sure that the next generation of this family would inherit something better than what I walked into. Here is what I know now. And it's the only thing I really came here to tell you. Being needed is not the same as being loved. For 31 years I confused the two. I thought if I made myself indispensable, I'd be safe. But you can be the most useful person in the room and still be the first one they ask to leave. Love is not what people say at your husband's funeral. Love is who shows up in the 8 months before it. Love is action, not blood, and not proximity, and not the warm voice someone uses at Christmas. And here's the other thing. The quiet ones are not the weak ones. I never raised my voice through any of this. I never had to. Dignity is not the absence of power. Sometimes it is the very shape of it. The people who underestimate you because you're gentle are simply writing, in advance, the story of their own surprise. Thomas knew that about me before I knew it about myself. He left me page 7 not because he thought I couldn't take care of myself, but because he knew I'd spent so many years taking care of everyone else that I'd forgotten I was allowed to be taken care of, too. His last gift to me wasn't the money. It was permission. Permission to stop asking to belong, and to simply finally belong to myself. So let me leave you with a question because I read every single comment and I want to know. If someone did to you what Diane did to me, if the people who were supposed to love you told you to leave, at the worst moment of your life, would you have said, understood, and walked away quietly? Or would you have burned it all down in that living room? There's no wrong answer. I've made peace with mine, but I'd like to hear yours. Tell me in the comments below. And if this story stayed with you, if you know what it's like to be the one who always poured the coffee and was never quite counted as family, then stay with me. Because the next story I'm going to tell you is about a mother who was told there was no room for her at the wedding she paid for. What she did with the seating chart is something I still think about. Watch that one next. Subscribe to Aveline Justice. New stories every single day, and every one of them, like this one, is for anyone who was ever made to feel small by the people who should have lifted them up. Because the truth, it always finds its way to the surface. I'm Nell. Thank you for sitting with me. I'll see you in the next one.